Today, we're mostly going to talk about mesocortical circuitry and function, and dopamine within the mesocortical circuit. And the reason that we're doing that is that today's discussion is really about motivation, procrastination, goal setting, and pursuit. It's very important to understand that neither dopamine nor the mesocortical circuit cares about any specific goal or pursuit. This is a circuit that uses dopamine in order to pursue anything. Now, of course, some people have a greater propensity to pursue things like work or goals in athletics or relationships or a combination of those. Other people, unfortunately, have a greater propensity to pursue things like drugs of abuse. What are drugs of abuse? Drugs of abuse tend to be drugs that increase levels of dopamine to the extent that other types of pursuits in life that are adaptive for us, like work, relationship, school, etc., become irrelevant. In fact, the definition of addiction that I use and that I believe really matches the neurobiology very well is that addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure. Healthy functioning of the mesocortical pathway, however, allows us to toggle or switch back and forth between different types of pursuits of all the sorts that I've mentioned earlier. So if we can understand how that mesocortical pathway works just a little bit, in particular, when dopamine is released and when it's not released, what dopamine does when it's released to our sense of motivation and drive, and if we can understand a little bit about how our recent dopamine history, that is, whether or not there is dopamine in our system already, dictates whether or not we are going to feel motivated in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes, hours, days, and weeks. That is all very easy to understand. I promise I'll explain it to you in a simple way. But I want you to get a circuit into your mind. I want you to envision that there are these neurons, little nerve cells in the VTA and nucleus accumbens. Those neurons make dopamine. They send their projections that we call axons, which are like little wires, and they can release dopamine into the prefrontal cortex. And now you already know, because you learned it a few minutes ago, that the prefrontal cortex then can ensure that certain behaviors take place and other behaviors do not take place, that or quieting that we talked about earlier. With that in mind, let's now take a look at how dopamine is released, and let's keep two things in mind. There are peaks in dopamine. That is, dopamine is released into the frontal cortex where it has these effects of activating or suppressing action. And we can think of those as peaks in dopamine. So I call it a spike. That means an increase and then a decrease. If I call it a peak, it's an increase and then a decrease. There can also be troughs in dopamine. What do I mean by that? Well, we have peaks in dopamine, and that peak in dopamine can rise up and then go back to what we call baseline, or there can be a trough. It can go below baseline. So the two key things to understand about dopamine is that we have dopamine peaks that are triggered by certain behaviors, certain compounds, drugs or substances, food, etc., and that we have a dopamine baseline. Our dopamine baseline is our reservoir of dopamine. It's how full or empty our dopamine pool is. And that dopamine pool is the pool of dopamine that we use in order to create those dopamine peaks. And when those peaks come down, sometimes they go back to baseline and sometimes they go to lower than baseline, which we call the trough. If any of this seems confusing, I want you just to imagine a wave pool. This is an analogy that was given to me by one of our podcast guests, which is Dr. Kyle Gillette, who's an obesity specialist and works on a number of things related to endocrine hormone function, including testosterone, estrogen in both men and women. I want to check out his episodes on hormone health. They're fascinating and actionable. He's a tremendous wealth of knowledge. And he has this analogy for how dopamine works in our brain and body. And that analogy is this notion of a wave pool. If you've ever seen a wave pool, it's basically a concrete pool and there are waves within it. Okay, duh. Those waves can be of different heights. So they can be little ripples, and we can think of those as little mini peaks, or they can be big waves. They can be really big crashing waves. If the height of those waves and the frequency of those waves is very, very large, some of that water, which here I'm using as an analogy to dopamine, can slosh out of the wave pool and the baseline drops. However, if those peaks are small enough or they are seldom enough, well, then the baseline, that is the water level in that pool, stays more or less constant. I think this is an excellent analogy for how dopamine works in the mesocortical pathway as it relates to motivation and pursuit and all those sorts of things, because we really need to think about how the peaks and the baseline relate to one another. And this is very important. The peaks and the baseline are not independent of one another. They relate to one another. So now you have in your mind a wave pool, and just understand that if you get a great big huge wave, maybe one of them will crash out and some of that water will splash out. The baseline will go down a little bit. But if you get big peak after big peak after big peak, pretty soon you're going to empty that pool. Whereas if you have smaller waves or less frequent big waves, well then the baseline will stay relatively constant. So let's think about dopamine peaks and baselines. And let's remember that for every peak, there's a trough. What do I mean by that? Well, when you have a wave, you also have the bottom of the wave. When you have a mountain, you have the bottom of the mountain. When we think about dopamine peaks and dopamine baselines, we have to include that trough, because that trough, that is the level of dopamine below baseline, really dictates whether or not you are going to feel motivated to pursue something or not. So I'm going to give you a visual in your mind. The visual in your mind is an increase in dopamine that's triggered by your desire for something, and really could be your desire for anything. If you're hungry and you're thinking about, I really want a sandwich, I really want a, let's think, what sandwich would I want right now? A really nice roast beef sandwich on sourdough with a slice of Swiss, tomatoes, a slice of pickle. Here I'm describing the sandwich that I would want. So if you're hungry and you're thinking about that, dopamine starts rising. This is crucially important to understand. Dopamine is not just released when we get the reward, when we get the thing that we're pursuing. Dopamine is released in anticipation of what we want. That increase in dopamine is by no happenstance, no mistake, relates also to our propensity and desire to move. Remember earlier I told you there's a separate circuit of dopamine that triggers movement, and that when it's depleted is causing things like deficits in movement related to Parkinson's or other movement disorders. Well, that's not pure coincidence. That's because desire and the need to move in order to pursue and reach goals are one and the same process. So if I desire a sandwich, or I desire a cup of coffee, or I desire some water when I'm thirsty, there's an increase in dopamine that we could call a little mini peak in dopamine. But then here's the key thing. Very soon after I realize my desire for something, that peak that was caused by the desire comes down and drops below baseline, below the level of dopamine that it was prior to even thinking about the sandwich or the coffee or the glass of water. And it's that drop below baseline that triggers my desire to go out and find that sandwich, that coffee, that water, or that blank. Insert whatever it is that you happen to desire, action or substance of any kind or person, etc. So that drop below baseline is fundamental to the whole process. And that drop below baseline was triggered by the preceding peak. So let's say that I desire a sandwich, there's an increase in dopamine, then very quickly it comes down below baseline just a little bit. Now I'm in pursuit of the sandwich. I'm looking for where I can get that sandwich. I order it, perhaps to be delivered. I can go out and find it. Now is the stage in which I have to think about what are the different stimuli, that is the things in my environment that signal whether or not I'm likely to get that sandwich or not. Okay, so for instance, if I were to go to my phone and order food on an app or walk down the street and see the sign for a deli, that's a cue that I'm likely to relieve that drop in dopamine and get not just back to baseline, but that I'll get a peak in dopamine. And indeed, that's what happens. If I find that deli, I go into the deli, they're open, they're making the sandwich that I want, they make my sandwich, and great, I get that sandwich. And that sandwich will have some degree of inherent reward to it, some degree of my liking it or not liking it. So let's say I like it, best sandwich I've ever had, but all I'm doing is comparing my desire for that sandwich to the sandwich that I actually got and ate. And chances are it's going to relieve that craving, meaning it will take that dopamine that had fallen below baseline up, back to baseline. And if I like the sandwich, it's going to indeed increase that dopamine again to another peak. Now, if I love the sandwich, like it's the most delicious thing that I've ever tasted in my entire life, well, then I'll get a big peak in dopamine when I consume that reward. However, chances are that the sandwich is more or less as I expect it to be, which is pretty good. I'll eat it and I'm fine. What do I mean by fine? Well, there's a concept called reward prediction error. Reward prediction error says that the dopamine that it is experienced, that's released from the VTA and nucleus accumbens, is going to be of a certain value. And that value is going to be compared to the desire and expectation of what I thought I was going to get. So if you take what you actually got minus what you expected, that's reward prediction error. So if the sandwich is basically what I expected to get, fine. Dopamine comes down basically to a baseline level that's pretty standard for me and is basically the baseline level I had before I ever thought about the sandwich at all. If the sandwich completely surprises me and is completely amazing, just an amazing sandwich, well then, the level of dopamine that I experience when I consume that sandwich is going to be even greater, and it's going to be that minus what I expected. So there, it's a bigger reward prediction error in the direction of higher peak by consuming the sandwich. And then, of course, there's the other possibility, which is the deli's closed, or the sandwich they make me is lousy or doesn't taste good, or something happened in the consuming of that sandwich that just makes it a bad experience. In which case, if we take that reward experienced minus reward predicted from the initial craving, well, then it's going to be less than what I expected, and therefore the baseline drops below where it was prior to even desiring the sandwich. Okay, so all of this might seem a little bit complicated, but it's all very simple. Desire for things increases dopamine, but then our level of dopamine drops below baseline, and it's that drop below baseline that triggers the motivation to bring that dopamine level back up by going and pursuing the thing that you wanted in the first place. Of course, as this is happening, you're not conscious of your dopamine levels. You experience this as context-dependent craving and pursuit. Because remember, the prefrontal cortex is involved in context setting and craving and pursuit because it relates to action and movement, which is one of the general features of the dopamine system. So you can start to see how this is a beautifully designed system, and you can also see how it's a perfect system for desire and pursuit of anything, not just sandwiches, as I'm giving you in this somewhat trivial but everyday and therefore applicable example. So just by understanding reward prediction error, and especially by understanding that a craving triggers a peak in dopamine that makes you motivated, but then drops your level of dopamine below baseline, which makes you even more motivated, you are already halfway through the conceptual aspect of today's podcast. Because if you can understand that, you will understand why, for instance, when you initially want something or you think you want something, it puts you into motion, but then pretty quickly you're starting to feel the pain of not having that, and that is also contributing to your desire to pursue that thing. Okay, this is a subtle effect, but if you watch for it, you'll start to see it or experience it within yourself. Your craving for things is not just about craving for those things per se. It's also a desire to relieve the pain of not having those things. And if you can internalize that and start to develop an awareness around it, you will be in an amazing position to leverage all sorts of aspects of the dopamine system in order to increase your motivation, especially when things get really hard or when you have the propensity to procrastinate, which is something that we'll get into a little bit later in the podcast. Now I'd like to talk about the dynamics of dopamine release with a little bit more detail. And this is something I've never covered on any social media post or on any podcast, either this one or as a guest on other podcasts, because on the face of it, it might seem a little too detailed. Like, why is he telling me all this? Isn't it just enough to know that there are peaks and troughs and baselines in dopamine? Well, it turns out that if you can understand what that peak and trough are really about, in other words, what's really happening when we zoom in on that peak and trough, you'll be in an amazing position to overcome procrastination and essentially pursue any goals in an ongoing basis. So I'm very excited to share this information with you because I do think that it has tremendous actionable power. What I'm about to describe relates to a number of different findings that have been made, mostly over the last 5 to 10 years, although to be quite direct, mostly within the last 5 years. And it has to do with the fact that the peak and trough and baseline that I talked about a moment ago that are associated with craving, they look like a peak followed by a trough, followed by a return to baseline and maybe another peak if you get the reward, or a drop below baseline if you don't, or you don't like what you got. But if we were to zoom in on that peak and the reward, in other words, to really zoom in on the whole process and start thinking about the circuitry, that is the neurons in VTA and nucleus accumbens and how it relates to the frontal cortex in a bit more detail, what we discover is nothing short of amazing. What we discover is that whenever we're pursuing something, we are always looking for cues as to whether or not we are on the right path to achieve that thing. And we are also setting a mindset or a context within our brains as to whether or not we are confident or pessimistic as to whether or not we're going to achieve that thing. Now, this is vitally important for anyone out there who finds it hard to get motivated and stay motivated. It's also vitally important for anyone who's psychologically minded in any way. You don't have to be a psychologist, but psychologically minded in any way and wonders, why is it that some people are just so motivated and other people have such trouble with motivation? Why is it that some people require perfect conditions in order to achieve things and other people just seem to manage to pursue things no matter what? It also relates to the fact that some of us are very good at achieving our goals in one context and not so much in another. So here's what you need to understand. I'll stay with the example of the roast beef sandwich just because we already have that in mind, but you can replace roast beef sandwich with essentially any goal. The cue that we're going to likely get what we want. So for instance, the sign that there's a deli on the corner, or that I open my phone and that there's an app that represents a restaurant that sells the particular sandwich that I like. That cue, as I mentioned before, increases dopamine. You see that and you're like, oh, okay. And subconsciously, there's already a signal that's initiated by that dopamine that I'm on the right path. Then, as I mentioned, dopamine drops below baseline. That's further contributing to my desire to go pursue that sandwich, either with my thumbs on my phone through the app or with my feet and walking to the deli, standing in line and so forth. Then, as I mentioned before, there is a peak in dopamine of varying height depending on how satisfying I find the reward to be when I actually get that sandwich, get that goal. Now keep in mind, there is some time delay between the cue, the app, the deli, etc., and when I get my sandwich. That gap is going to be different for different things. So in pursuing a 4-year degree, it's going to be 4 years if the diploma is your goal. If it's an exam you're studying for, it might be a week long. And there will be many other signals in between that initial cue that, hey, the reward likely lies down this path, in this textbook, this dating app, or at that deli. There are many other cues. Those cues come in subconsciously and involve everything from how long the line is at the deli to, whether or not you're, seeing the types of people on a dating app that you'd like to see, whether or not they're responding to you, whether or not someone's texting you back or not. All of those cues are integrated and adjusting your baseline level of dopamine all the time as you go to pursue that goal. So what the dopamine system does is it doesn't just compare the height of the peak at the beginning, right? I desire that to the reward that you got. We talked about reward prediction error. That's the kind of first grade version of reward prediction error. It's also taking into account all the things that happen in between, and all of that is serving as a cue for the eventual reward, and all of that is funneling into what we call reward prediction error. In other words, the dopamine system is very good at subconsciously parsing what are the things that happen between wanting and getting. And that's part of the learning that dopamine achieves. And indeed, there are specialized circuits from the VTA and nucleus accumbens that are involved in just the learning of how we achieve or don't achieve specific types of rewards that we desire. So this is called reward contingent learning because it's learning the contingencies of what led up to a reward or what didn't lead up to a reward. At the same time and in parallel, there's an ongoing release of dopamine in the background. And that ongoing release of dopamine that has nothing to do with learning is really just sort of a propeller that's driving us in the direction of whatever it is that we're trying to pursue. So I realize for some of you, this might seem like unnecessary or perhaps even an overwhelming amount of detail, but it's actually quite simple. Your brain is trying to figure out what happened prior to getting or not getting a reward. And it's comparing what you wanted compared to what you got. At the same time, the dopamine system initiates a motivation signal that takes you through that entire round of pursuit. And those three things, there's the stimulus, the desire, the I want that. That's the first thing, leads to that peak. The peak drops a little bit below baseline and it triggers motivation. The motivation is the second thing. The motivation is dopamine release also, but from a separate set of neurons within this circuit, driving you forward. And the entire time that it's driving you forward, it's paying attention to what's there along the way, even if you don't realize it consciously. And then there's the reward itself or the lack of reward itself. So those three components, the learning contingency, which has to do with the stimulus and the reward and everything that happens in between, and the propeller nature of dopamine, as I'm referring to it, those all combine into a total learning so that after you get the sandwich or after you finish the exam or after you go out on a date or after you do anything that you desire to do, that system that originates in the VTA and nucleus accumbens and goes up to your cortex, it learned. It learned many things. It learned the contingency between stimulus and desire, motivation, and whether or not you succeeded or not. It's basically a scoreboard for how you did given what just happened. So actually, it's all very simple. In fact, if you can understand even just half of what I just said, you are now in a far better position to understand everything from addiction to motivation to procrastination, and it will make sense of all the tools that I'm going to talk about next, which will allow you to overcome procrastination points, to overcome deficits in motivation, and indeed to reset your motivation in an ongoing way so that you can reach your goals. Okay, so let's take everything that I just told you and set it aside. It's still important, but let's just set it aside. You don't have to think about any of those details or names or anything. Let's just think about addiction. Because in biology and in psychology, frankly, it really often pays to think about the extremes first and then work our way towards more typical circumstances. And with that said, addiction, unfortunately, is very common nowadays. I just heard a statistic, in fact, that there is an 80% increase in alcohol use disorder among women in the last 30 years. I talked a little bit about this in the episode that I did about alcohol and health. Again, I want to be very clear. I'm not somebody that is completely against alcohol for adults, provided they're not alcoholics. Turns out 2 drinks a week, probably fine health-wise. 0 would be better. We're honest. 0 is better than any alcohol. But 2 drinks a week is probably fine. Past 2 drinks, you start running into problems. And yet many, many people out there, male and female alike, suffer from alcohol use disorder, also called alcoholism. The same is also true for things like methamphetamine or cocaine or other types of substance addictions. And the same is also true for a lot of behavioral or what are sometimes called process addictions, things like sex addiction or video game addiction or any type of behavior that frankly is leveraging the dopamine system, but that engages this progressive narrowing of the things that bring someone pleasure such that nothing else is really salient. Nothing else is really pulling them in the way that their video games or sex or pornography or alcohol, pick your substance or, behavior that you see out there or hopefully not, but that you might suffer from an addiction to. So what's happening in addiction? Well, addiction involves dopamine, among other things, often, the opioid system, etc. But if we were to think about what's the stimulus in an addiction and what's the peak in dopamine, and then what happens after that peak, it all becomes very clear as to why addiction happens and why it's so pernicious. So for instance, let's take cocaine. Cocaine causes dramatic increases in dopamine very, very fast. So if somebody craves cocaine, what are they craving? They're craving that dopamine peak. They're craving the increased level of alertness. They're craving a number of things associated with the feeling of being under the influence of the drug. But the stimulus for it simply becomes that line of cocaine. Or in the case of crack, that crack rock that they're going to smoke. And God forbid they're mainlining it. They're shooting into a vein. What happens is they snort, smoke, or inject cocaine, and dopamine levels almost immediately go up to a very high peak. Okay, so the time gap between the stimulus and the dopamine is very, very short. So short, in fact, that there's really no other contingencies in between that the mesocortical system has to learn. In fact, what does the system, quote unquote, learn? It learns cocaine equals massive amounts of dopamine equals feeling euphoric and energetic, etc. And in doing that, it reinforces the whole circuit so that short, we can even say hyper short contingency is really what the system wants. So much so that longer contingencies of, say, putting in the hard work of generating a fitness program or a professional program for yourself or a education program, which takes not just many days, but many weeks and years. Well, none of that is going to lead to peaks in dopamine that are as high as the peak in dopamine associated with cocaine. So that tells us something critical. It is both the duration between desire and effect. And when I say effect, I mean the rewarding properties of dopamine that are experienced. That's important. So very short gaps teach the system to expect and want short gaps. Makes it very hard to pursue things that take longer. So when we say it's the short, or in this case, hyper short distance or time between the stimulus and the dopamine, what we're really talking about, if we were to plot this out on a board or on a piece of paper, is the steepness of the rise of that peak. It's very, very steep. The peak in dopamine is coming up very fast after the desire. And in addition to that, and this is very important, the higher the peak in dopamine and the faster the rise to that peak, the further below baseline the dopamine drops after the drug wears off. Okay, so in the case of cocaine, it's a very fast and very large rise in dopamine, followed by a steep drop and very deep trough in dopamine below baseline. You say, okay, so there's pleasure, then there's lack of pleasure. But it's worse than that, because it's not just lack of pleasure. If you recall what we talked about a little bit earlier, that drop below baseline triggers the desire and the pursuit for what? For more. And so this sets in motion a vicious loop where people start pursuing peaks in dopamine that can come very fast without much effort. And that's one of the ways in which addictions start to take hold. Now, there's a simple way to think about this and to remember if you want to avoid this whole thing. I mean, the first one is obvious. Don't do cocaine, don't try it, don't use it. Certainly don't get addicted to it. Those are all sort of one and the same, frankly. I don't know many people that, despite opinions to the contrary, that use cocaine recreationally, that don't at some point run into either a financial, psychological, physical, or some other problem. The other thing that happens after those big, fast increases in dopamine caused by things like cocaine is afterwards, when it quickly drops below baseline, it takes a much longer time to get back to the original baseline than it did prior to using the drug. And worse still is that the peaks in dopamine that are created from more consumption of cocaine leads to progressively lower peaks and deeper troughs below baseline. So the whole system is shifting away from pleasure and more to pain and the desire for pursuit of the drug. This is a terrible situation, and it's a terrible situation that's not just unique to cocaine. In fact, if we were to look at the averages, and again, these are averages, of the height of the peaks in dopamine that are created by different substances and the rates at which those peaks take place, because remember, the time to peak is just as important as how high that peak goes, we see some pretty interesting numbers. So for instance, and again, these are averages based on neuroimaging combined with what are called PET scans, positron emission tomography, combined with blood draws and a number of other data from both animal and human studies. What you find is that at baseline, just kind of on a background of no drug taking of any kind, the neurons in the ventrotegmental nucleus accumbens area are firing at a rate of about 3 to 4 per second, releasing dopamine. So that's your baseline of dopamine release. Your forebrain is always seeing a little bit of dopamine from that system. If you were then to anticipate food and you're relatively hungry, that would double. Okay, so this probably happened when you decide to eat lunch today if you were hungry prior to eating lunch. It doubles in anticipation of the food, and then depending on how much you enjoyed that food, it might triple or quadruple. It might be lower than it was during the anticipation, as we talked about before. So there's an approximate doubling under conditions of desiring and consuming food. Let's take nicotine as the next example. For people that use nicotine, either smoking, vaping, snuffing, or dipping, all routes of nicotine administration that I covered in our episode about nicotine, there's about a 150% increase in the rate of dopamine neuron firing. Cocaine is going to increase the rate of dopamine output into the prefrontal cortex by about 1,000%. Okay, so what you're really talking about here is a 10-fold increase in the amount of dopamine that's released into the prefrontal cortex as measured by the rates of firing of these dopamine neurons. Methamphetamine is going to be anywhere from 1,000%, anywhere up to 10,000%. It really varies depending on the potency of the drug and a few other factors. And here's where perhaps it gets a little more interesting. Some of you are probably wondering about caffeine or about sex or about video games. Now, there the numbers vary tremendously. And it's really important to understand that across the board, not just for caffeine, sex, video games, but also for nicotine, alcohol, and other substances and what we call motivated behaviors, some of which are part of a healthy life, like eating and reproduction, provided it's, age appropriate, context appropriate, species appropriate, consensual, well, then we consider it adaptive. If it's not, well, then it's considered maladaptive. Some people will sit down to play a video game They really like video games. And as they're sitting down, they will experience a 5-fold increase in the rate of dopamine output from their nucleus accumbens. For other people, it's going to be a 10-fold increase. For other people like me who don't like video games very much, I don't have anything against them. I don't dislike them, but it doesn't do much for me. It might not cause any increase whatsoever. It might even cause a decrease in dopamine. So there's a lot of individual variability. For sex, it turns out to be a range. So the typical range that's cited in the literature is anywhere from a 4 to 5-fold increase in the rate of dopamine neuron firing. However, there are certain individuals for which that number is doubled. Caffeine is a little bit of a special circumstance because caffeine has the property of not just causing the release of dopamine, but increasing the amount of dopamine receptors over time. And there aren't a lot of excellent measurements of the amount of dopamine released as a function of caffeine intake in different populations of humans. It's mostly animal studies. But what we think based on the gestalt, based on the overall picture of the literature, is that it's an approximate doubling of the dopamine signaling that's coming out of the VTA and nucleus accumbens to prefrontal cortex when we anticipate and when we drink our coffee. Again, I really want to be clear that for all of these things, these are relative levels and they are distribution. So if we were to plot them out on paper, you would see that these are not bar graphs. These are overlapping curves to some extent. So some people are going to achieve more dopamine release or less dopamine release from one behavior or substance. However, it's very clear that cocaine, methamphetamine, even heroin for that matter, are way out on the right-hand side of the curve, causing enormous increases in dopamine very quickly. And the other things that we described have, again, a distribution that is more leftward shifted on this imaginary plot that I'm creating. It's a lot of individual variability. However, it's fascinating that dopamine is the single molecule that's causing the craving and pursuit and experience of all of these substances and behaviors. And the learning of all of that craving, pursuit, and actual experience is what predicts whether or not we will re-engage, reuse that substance or not, re-engage in a behavior or not, and how frequently we will do that. So that's addiction. But if you understand how the height of those peaks in dopamine and the rate to reach those peaks and the troughs that result and how long the troughs take to get back to baseline, if you understand or a little or all of that, you're really in a terrific position to understand how to leverage the dopamine system for the pursuit of healthy goals and behaviors. I should mention one thing about recovery from addiction, which is that the reset of all that dopamine circuitry from unhealthy to healthy often involves, depending on the addiction, 30 days of complete abstinence. That 30 days of complete abstinence inevitably involves a lot of pain and discomfort and craving, anxiety, insomnia, etc., that relates to the big trough in dopamine that inevitably occurs. Now, of course, there are some addictions, such as severe alcohol addiction, and in some cases, opiate addiction, that immediate and sustained abstinence cannot be used as the tool. Somebody really needs to work with an addiction specialist, and sometimes there needs to be a tapering off of the substance. For other addictions, it can be, quote unquote, cold turkey. And then, of course, there are other addictions, in particular food and sex, but sometimes even things like video games, for which the desired outcome is not necessarily to eliminate the behavior completely, but to set some constraints around the behavior so that it's not occurring to the exclusion of other pleasureful things in life and adaptive things in life. And for that, there is the requirement for what are called binding behaviors. We'll get back to binding behaviors later, but binding behaviors are behaviors in which people bind their behavior around a particular substance use or around a particular behavioral addiction, like sex, video games, etc., in space and or time. In space, meaning they might only engage in those particular behaviors in certain places and certain times when it's context appropriate. Okay, there are numerous examples of binding behaviors in space and time, and it all has to do with clamping or directing when the engagement with the dopamine releasing behavior is going to occur. So what's happening when people decide to go cold turkey or they use these binding behaviors? Well, what's happening is that people are engaging the specific circuitry within the prefrontal cortex that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, are important for context setting. So in the cases of binding behaviors, the prefrontal cortex is essentially getting trained up to understand that, okay, certain things like food or perhaps sex or perhaps video games, they're okay if they are done or consumed in appropriate amounts or in particular contexts. That requires the context-setting, goal-directed behavior that the prefrontal cortex is responsible. Okay, so for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we've been talking a lot about addiction. And actually, this is not an episode about addiction. However, if you understand a little bit about the dopamine dynamics in an addiction, you can leverage that knowledge towards healthy, adaptive goal pursuit and achieving your goals. So let's think about that in the context of what generates dopamine peaks, what generates desire to pursue goals, what causes our readout of whether or not we achieved a goal or not. In other words, what allows us to learn how to pursue goals of different kinds, not just get good at achieving one kind of goal, but really understand and get really, really good at setting goals and pursuing goals of different kinds that are adaptive in different areas of life, right? Because we all are going to have to pursue goals in school, work, relationships, fitness, mental health, and on in order to be our best selves. That's clear. Well, all of that is possible using the same basic set of dopamine circuits and the same basic dynamics of dopamine. So for instance, if we are going to feel motivated at all, that is, if we are going to wake up in the morning or have any period of time during our day in which we feel like we are capable of pursuing goals, we are going to have a healthy level of baseline dopamine. In other words, we are going to have enough dopamine in the wave pool, enough water in the wave pool, that is, before we can generate any waves or peaks in dopamine, let alone troughs and the rest. So how do we achieve a healthy baseline level of dopamine? Well, there we can really look to some foundational practices that perhaps you've heard about on this podcast before, and that to some of you might seem a little mundane, although some of them are a bit more sophisticated, maybe even esoteric. The good news is that we can all control these things, and they don't require purchasing anything, but they do require some degree of regular upkeep and effort. Those things include what I call the very basics. Now, the very basics, put in the context of today's discussion, are the things that put water in the wave pool. Those are going to be getting sufficient amounts of quality sleep each night. Getting sufficient sleep each night literally restores your dopamine reserves. It allows dopamine to be present and for you to have a level of baseline dopamine that will allow you to even consider your goals in any kind of meaningful or reasonable way. Second, there are practices that are supported by the scientific literature to increase your baseline level of dopamine that are independent of sleep, but are similar to sleep. And I like to refer to these as non-sleep deep rest. This is not meditation. There's actually very little evidence that meditation of the traditional kind of, sitting eyes closed, third eye focusing on your third eye center, which is this area behind your forehead. There is very little evidence that increases levels of dopamine. There is a place for meditation in the context of today's discussion, but I'll repeat, meditation itself is a focusing exercise. It is not known to increase dopamine. However, non-sleep deep rest, so-called NSDR, very similar, although different to what's sometimes called yoga nidra, which is where you lie there, you do a sort of body scan, some long exhale breathing. NSDR is very similar. Those have been shown to increase the amount of dopamine in your dopamine reserves by up to 65%, which is a remarkable number. So quality sleep, non-sleep deep rest, aka yoga nidra, very powerful ways to keep your baseline level of dopamine at a sufficient level. The third thing on the list, and again, these are things that we come back to almost every episode, but I don't think they can be repeated enough because these are really things that we need to focus on every 24 hours. You might be able to skip a day here or there if you get sick or you're traveling or you have some major life event, but really every 24 hours we need to re-up our sleep. We need to re-up our nutrients. Even if you're fasting, you're re-upping your nutrients from stored sources within your body. The third thing is sunlight. You want to try and view sunlight as early in the day as possible, 5 to 10 minutes on a clear day, minimum, 10 to 20 minutes on a cloudy day, minimum, 20 or 30 minutes on a very overcast day, minimum, without sunglasses. Don't stare at the sun. Please don't damage your eyes. Look slightly off from the sun, but yes, you want to face eastward towards the sun. And on those cloudy days, that's especially important to do. Why? Well, viewing morning sunlight increases cortisol early in the day, which is excellent because you want cortisol elevated early in the day and you want it lower later in the day. And because of the relationship between the cells in your eye that sense sunlight, specifically morning sunlight, believe it or not, that happens, and signal to your hypothalamus, and the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary and other endocrine organs, it sets in motion a dopamine-related cascade in neuromodulators, dopamine, and hormones that lead to states of well-being, elevated mood, alertness, etc. throughout the day. It also helps your sleep at night, but today we're talking about dopamine. So yes, believe it or not, that morning sunlight exposure does increase your levels of dopamine, not just cortisol. And fourth on the list is going to be movement, exercise of varying kinds. It could be resistance training, it could be cardiovascular training. That does increase levels of dopamine. Here, we're not talking about achieving peaks in dopamine. Right? That could be accomplished through setting a personal record, a PR, or through sprints or heavy lifts, or learning some new dynamic movement. What we're really talking about here is getting into a regular exercise program of, if not every day, at least 5 days a week, a mixture of cardiovascular and resistance exercise. That we also know is known to elevate and maintain an elevated level of baseline dopamine. So it's not just about the euphoria you feel during or after exercise. It's also about the baseline level of dopamine that's achieved through regular movement and engaging in movement. And if you're asking how could that be, well, you already know the answer. The circuits in the brain and body that generate movement, not just goal seeking, but movement itself, as I mentioned earlier, that nigrostriatal pathway. And yes, that circuit is separate from the VTA nucleus accumbens to cortical circuit, the mesocortical circuit that we've mainly been focusing on today, but they interact. And so by engaging in regular movement, you ensure that you're maintaining elevated levels of baseline dopamine, which is what you want if you're going to be able to engage in any kind of motivated pursuit behavior of any kind. So those are the fundamentals that will set the level of baseline dopamine in your system. A couple of key points. Yes, there is variation based on both genetics and circumstance in baseline levels of dopamine. If someone's going through a particular hard time, or if somebody inherited a gene in the dopamine synthesis pathway that simply affords them higher levels of baseline dopamine, we likely know these people. They seem hyper-motivated all the time, not just based on prior success, but they just seem to have a lot of energy and a lot of go drive. You talk about activation energy. Some of you may know what that term means, others of you won't. Having low activation energy is great. I mean, the amount of energy that it takes to get into action to pursue adaptive and meaningful, healthy goals. Some people just seem to have lower activation energy, and higher levels of dopamine are probably associated with that. Some of us have lower levels of baseline dopamine. Regardless, everyone needs to engage in the foundational things that I just mentioned a few moments ago every 24 hours, or at least strive to. There is no escaping that.